The morning sun peeked over the rooftops, casting a golden glow across the quiet suburban street. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of fallen leaves that had been raked into neat piles along driveways. It was the kind of day where everything seemed to move in slow motion, calm, predictable, and peaceful. Birds chirped cheerfully from nearby trees, and the distant hum of lawnmowers could be heard as some residents took advantage of the cool weather to tend to their yards. On one side of the street, a young girl named Emily was getting ready for her daily adventure. She was 10 years old, with curly blonde hair tied back in a ponytail and freckles sprinkled across her nose. Her favorite activity on mornings like this was riding her bright pink bicycle up and down the block. Today, she wore a yellow hoodie and jeans, her sneakers scuffed from countless rides around the neighborhood. With a quick wave to her mom, who was busy making pancakes in the kitchen, Emily hopped onto her bike and pedaled off with a grin. Across the street, Marcus was just starting his workday. A tall man in his late 40s, he had warm brown eyes and a gentle smile that made people feel instantly at ease. Dressed in his standard blue uniform, he moved methodically between trash bins, lifting them with practiced ease and emptying their contents into the rumbling garbage truck parked behind him. Marcus wasn't just good at his job. He took pride in it. He believed even something as simple as collecting trash could make a difference if done with care and respect. He knew most of the neighbors by name, often exchanging friendly greetings as they passed by. Some called out good morning, while others stopped to chat about the weather or weekend plans. Marcus always listened patiently, offering advice when asked or sharing a laugh over silly jokes. To many, he wasn't just the garbage man. He was part of the community, someone who added a little extra warmth to an otherwise mundane task. As Emily rode past Marcus's truck, she slowed down briefly to watch him work. She'd seen him plenty of times before, but never really thought much about what he did. Today, however, she noticed how strong he looked as he lifted heavy bins without breaking a sweat, and how carefully he placed each one back exactly where it belonged. For a moment, she considered saying hello, but shyness got the better of her, and she kept going. The neighborhood was alive with small sounds, the rustle of leaves blowing across the pavement, the occasional bark of a dog somewhere in the distance, and the steady rhythm of Marcus's movements. Everything seemed perfectly normal, almost boringly so. No one could have guessed that within minutes, this tranquil scene would transform into something far more dramatic. Little did they know, the calm morning was about to give way to chaos, setting off a chain of events that would leave everyone questioning what they thought they knew about trust, fear, and humanity. The peace of the morning was shattered in an instant. Emily had just turned a corner at the end of the street when she spotted a large dog bounding toward her from a nearby yard. Its owner's gate must have been left open, and now the animal, big, loud, and unfamiliar, was charging straight in her direction. To Emily, it felt like something out of a nightmare. The dog wasn't necessarily aggressive. Its tail wagged furiously as it ran, but to a child who didn't know any better, its size and speed were terrifying. Her heart began to race as adrenaline surged through her tiny body. She tried to pedal faster, gripping the handlebars tightly, but panic made her clumsy. Her front tire hit a crack in the sidewalk, sending her tumbling off the bike with a thud. For a split second, she lay there on the ground, dazed and breathless, before scrambling to her feet. Tears welled up in her wide, frightened eyes as she looked around desperately for help. That's when she saw Marcus. Marcus was still working by his truck, completely unaware of the drama unfolding behind him. When Emily stumbled into view, sobbing uncontrollably, he froze mid-lift, startled by the sight of the distraught child running toward him. Without hesitation, he set the trash bin down and knelt to meet her halfway. Hey, what's wrong?" he asked gently, his voice calm despite the alarm bells ringing in his head. Emily didn't answer right away. Instead, she threw herself against him, clutching his arm as if holding on for dear life. Her cries grew louder, echoing down the quiet street. Neighbors began to peek out of windows or step onto their porches, curious about the commotion. One elderly woman paused mid-watering of her flowers, while a teenage boy stopped scrolling through his phone to watch the scene unfold. A few cars driving by slowed down, their drivers craning their necks to see what was happening. "Please," Emily managed to choke out between sobs. He scared me." Though her words were muffled and broken, Marcus understood enough to piece together that something, or someone, had frightened her badly. He wrapped a reassuring hand around her shoulder, trying to steady her trembling frame. "It's okay, sweetheart. You're safe now," he said softly, hoping his tone would calm her down. But even as he spoke, he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling creeping over him. Something about this moment felt heavier than it should. The growing crowd only added to the tension. People whispered among themselves, speculating about what might have happened. Some assumed Marcus was somehow involved, while others wondered aloud if there was more to the story. One man pulled out his phone and started recording, muttering under his breath about needing evidence, just in case. Another neighbor called 911, describing the situation vaguely. "There's a little girl crying, and she ran to some guy near the garbage truck." Within moments, the once quiet street transformed into a chaotic spectacle. Cars parked hastily along the curb as more neighbors gathered, some concerned, others merely curious. The air buzzed with murmurs and questions, each one amplifying the sense that something serious was happening. And yet, no one truly knew what had occurred. All they saw was a young white girl clinging to a black man, a sight that, in today's world, carried implications far beyond the simple act itself. As Marcus continued to comfort Emily, he couldn't ignore the weight of the stares directed at him. He could feel the judgment in the air, the unspoken suspicions lurking beneath the surface. His stomach churned with unease, but he forced himself to focus on the child in front of him. Whatever else was going on, she needed him to stay calm and present. Still, he couldn't help but wonder how quickly things had spiraled, and whether anyone would believe him when the truth finally came out. The sound of approaching sirens cut through the murmurs of the crowd like a knife, turning heads and drawing even more attention to the unfolding scene. Within moments, 2 police cars screeched to a halt at the edge of the street, their flashing red and blue lights casting an eerie glow over the otherwise peaceful neighborhood. Officers spilled out of the vehicles, their faces tense and focused as they assessed the situation. The sight of law enforcement arriving in full force sent a ripple of unease through the onlookers. Some took a step back, while others leaned in closer, eager to see what would happen next. One officer immediately approached Marcus and Emily, his hand hovering near the holster on his belt. "Sir, step away from the child," he barked, his voice sharp and commanding. Marcus froze, his hands instinctively rising into the air, as if to show he posed no threat. His heart pounded in his chest, confusion mixing with fear as he tried to process what was happening. He hadn't done anything wrong. Why were they treating him like a criminal? "I'm not hurting her," Marcus said firmly, though his voice shook slightly. "She came to me because she was scared. I was just trying to help." But the officer didn't seem to hear him, or perhaps he chose not to listen. Instead, he gestured for Marcus to move further away from Emily, who was now standing frozen, tears still streaming down her face. Another officer knelt beside her, speaking in a softer tone. "Sweetheart, can you tell me what happened?" he asked gently, his demeanor a stark contrast to the tension surrounding them. Meanwhile, the crowd continued to grow, fueled by curiosity and speculation. A few neighbors exchanged worried glances, whispering about how quickly the situation had escalated. One woman muttered under her breath, "This feels so unnecessary," while another snapped photos with her phone, determined to document everything. Social media posts began flooding timelines within minutes, each caption adding its own spin to the story. "Police called after girl runs to garbage man for help," one read, while another declared, "Suspicious activity reported in quiet neighborhood." Back at the center of it all, Marcus struggled to keep his composure. He glanced around at the sea of faces watching him, some judgmental, others sympathetic, but none offering any real support. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about helping a frightened child anymore. It was about something deeper, something uglier. Was it the color of his skin, the uniform he wore, or simply the fact that he was an unfamiliar figure in a moment of chaos? As the officers questioned Emily, her sobs began to subside, replaced by hiccups and sniffles. She clung to the leg of the officer kneeling beside her small frame trembling as she tried to explain herself. There was a big dog, she stammered, pointing vaguely in the direction she'd come from. It chased me, and I got scared. I ran here because she looked up at Marcus, her eyes wide and pleading. He made me feel safe. Her words hung in the air, momentarily silencing the murmurs of the crowd. For a brief second, it seemed like the misunderstanding might be resolved, but the damage had already been done. The initial call to 911, vague and alarmist, had set off a chain reaction that couldn't easily be undone. Even as the officers relaxed their stance slightly, the weight of suspicion lingered, heavy and suffocating. Marcus stood apart now, his arms crossed tightly over his chest as he watched the scene unfold. He wanted to believe that everything would be okay, that people would see the truth once Emily explained herself. But deep down, he knew better. This wasn't just about today or this moment. It was about the biases and assumptions that lurked beneath the surface of everyday life. And as the cameras clicked and the whispers continued, Marcus couldn't help but wonder how many times he'd have to prove himself before the world stopped seeing him as a threat. As the police cars drove away and the crowd began to disperse, the street slowly returned to its usual quiet rhythm. But the calm was deceptive. Underneath it, tension simmered, and the incident lingered heavily in the air. Neighbors who had been mere spectators earlier now found themselves grappling with discomfort, guilt, and confusion. Some retreated into their homes, shutting doors as if trying to block out the unease that had settled over the neighborhood. Others lingered outside, exchanging awkward glances or speaking in hushed tones about what they'd just witnessed. One woman, Mrs. Thompson, couldn't shake the image of Marcus standing there, hands raised, looking both bewildered and hurt. She had lived on this street for over 20 years and knew him well enough to say hello during his rounds. He always greeted her warmly, sometimes even helping carry her trash bins to the curb when she struggled with them. How could anyone think he'd harm a child? The thought made her stomach churn with shame. Gathering her courage, she approached Emily's parents, who were still comforting their daughter near the sidewalk. "I feel awful about what happened," Mrs. Thompson admitted, wringing her hands nervously. "Marcus is such a kind man. He doesn't deserve to be treated like that." Emily's mother nodded solemnly, her eyes red from holding back tears. "We're mortified too," she confessed. "It never should have gone this far. All because of, well, I guess fear got the better of us." Her words struck a chord with those listening nearby. Another neighbor, Mr. Patel, spoke up hesitantly. "It's not just fear, it's ignorance. We all jump to conclusions without knowing the full story." And honestly, his voice trailed off, but his meaning was clear. The color of Marcus's skin had played a role in how quickly people assumed the worst. It wasn't something anyone wanted to admit, but it was impossible to ignore. The conversation grew louder as more neighbors joined in, sharing their thoughts. One elderly man recounted how Marcus had once fixed his broken fence after a storm, refusing payment because that's just what neighbors do. A young mother mentioned how he always smiled at her kids and joked about giving them candy if they helped clean up litter. These stories painted a picture of a man who was deeply woven into the fabric of the community, not an outsider or a threat, as some had momentarily believed. Word spread quickly, and by late afternoon, a small group of residents decided to visit Marcus at his home to apologize personally. They knocked on the door of his modest apartment, unsure how he would react. When he opened it, his expression was guarded, though polite. Seeing the sincerity in their faces, he invited them inside, where they sat around his kitchen table, sipping coffee and talking openly about the day's events. "I'm sorry we doubted you," Mrs. Thompson said, her voice trembling. You've done so much for this neighborhood, and today showed us how wrong we can be when we let fear guide us." Marcus listened quietly, nodding occasionally. He appreciated their effort, but he also knew apologies couldn't erase the sting of being treated like a suspect in front of everyone. Still, he chose to focus on the positives, the fact that people were willing to confront their biases and learn from the situation. The discussion turned toward broader issues, like racial profiling and implicit bias. Some admitted they hadn't realized how deeply ingrained these prejudices were until today. Others vowed to pay closer attention to their own reactions in similar situations. By the end of the meeting, there was a sense of resolve among the group. They agreed to organize a community gathering to address these topics head-on, ensuring that this incident wouldn't fade into memory without sparking meaningful change. As the neighbors left Marcus's apartment, the weight of the day still hung heavy in the air. But for the first time since the chaos erupted, there was a glimmer of hope, a shared determination to turn this painful moment into an opportunity for growth. Marcus stood by his window, watching them walk away, and allowed himself a small smile. Change wouldn't come overnight, but maybe, just maybe, this was a step in the right direction. The community meeting marked a turning point for the neighborhood, sparking conversations that many residents had avoided for far too long. In the days that followed, the energy in the air was palpable. People were talking, reflecting, and taking action. Flyers appeared on bulletin boards and lampposts announcing new initiatives, like a Know Your Neighbor program designed to break down barriers and foster genuine connections. The idea was simple. Neighbors would be encouraged to spend time with one another, sharing meals, stories, or even just coffee. It wasn't groundbreaking, but it was a start, a way to humanize each other beyond surface-level assumptions. Marcus became an integral part of these efforts, stepping into a role he hadn't expected: mentor. As he continued his garbage collection route, he noticed more people waving at him, not just politely, but warmly, as if they truly meant it. Some stopped to chat, asking about his day or sharing updates about their own lives. One morning, a group of kids playing basketball near the curb called out to him. "Hey, Mr. Marcus," one of them shouted. "Can you teach us how to recycle better? My mom says you're an expert." At first, Marcus chuckled at the request, amused by their enthusiasm. But then he realized this was an opportunity to not only educate but also connect with the younger generation. Over the next few weeks, he began organizing informal sessions during his breaks, teaching kids, and sometimes their parents, about recycling, environmental responsibility, and the importance of keeping the neighborhood clean. What started as a casual conversation turned into something bigger, a chance to build trust and understanding in a way that felt natural and meaningful. Meanwhile, Emily's family took steps to ensure their daughter understood the significance of what had happened. Her parents sat her down one evening, explaining why Marcus had been treated unfairly and how fear and bias could cloud judgment. They used age-appropriate language, emphasizing kindness, empathy, and the value of seeing people for who they really are. Emily listened intently, her brows furrowed in concentration. When they finished, she looked up at them with determination in her eyes. "I want to tell him I'm sorry," she declared firmly. "Not just in a note. I want to say it." Her parents agreed, and the following Saturday, they accompanied her to Marcus's apartment. This time, Emily didn't hide behind her mother. Instead, she walked right up to Marcus, holding a colorful drawing she'd made. It depicted the two of them standing side by side, surrounded by flowers and sunshine. "This is for you," she said shyly, handing it over. "Thank you for helping me when I was scared, and I'm sorry people weren't nice to you." Marcus knelt down to her level, touched by her sincerity. "You don't need to apologize, sweetheart," he replied gently. "But thank you for being brave enough to come here and say that." He patted her shoulder before standing up, glancing at her parents with a smile. "She's going to change the world someday," he added, his tone light but full of conviction. As word spread about these small yet impactful gestures, others in the community began following suit. Neighbors organized potluck dinners, inviting everyone, including those who might otherwise feel left out, to join in. Local schools hosted workshops on diversity and inclusion, bringing in speakers to discuss topics like racial bias and privilege. Even the local newspaper ran a feature story on Marcus, highlighting his contributions to the neighborhood and the lessons learned from the incident. The article ended with a powerful quote from him. "We all make mistakes, but the real test is whether we're willing to learn from them." By the end of the month, the atmosphere in the neighborhood had shifted noticeably. People seemed more open, more willing to engage with one another. Conversations that once might have been awkward or avoided altogether now flowed freely, driven by a shared desire to grow and improve. Of course, challenges remained. Old habits die hard, and biases don't disappear overnight. But there was a collective sense of progress. For the first time in a long while, the community felt united, bound together by a commitment to do better. As Marcus drove his garbage truck down the same streets where the chaos had unfolded weeks earlier, he couldn't help but smile. The road ahead wouldn't always be smooth, but for now, it felt like the neighborhood was heading in the right direction. And sometimes, that was enough. As the tension began to ease slightly, one of the officers crouched down beside Emily, his expression softening as he tried to coax more details from her. "Take your time, sweetheart," he said in a gentle voice, careful not to overwhelm her. "Can you tell me exactly what scared you?" His tone stood in stark contrast to the earlier commotion, and it seemed to help Emily gather her thoughts. She wiped her tear-streaked face with the sleeve of her hoodie, sniffling as she looked up at him. "There was a dog," she began hesitantly, her voice trembling but clearer now. "A really big one. It came running after me when I rode my bike past its yard. I thought it was going to bite me." Her small hands gestured wildly as if reliving the moment, her wide eyes still filled with fear. "I didn't know what to do, so I ran here because he," she pointed toward Marcus, "looked nice." The officer nodded slowly, piecing together her words. He turned to glance at Marcus, who stood a few feet away, watching silently. The other officer had lowered his defensive stance, though his hand remained close to his holster. The crowd, too, seemed to collectively hold its breath, waiting for clarity. A few neighbors exchanged glances, some visibly relaxing as they realized there might not be any sinister intent behind the scene. Another officer walked over to where Emily's bike lay abandoned on the sidewalk. Sure enough, just a short distance away, a large golden retriever sat wagging its tail near an open gate. Its owner, an older man in a flannel shirt, hurried out of his house upon seeing the commotion. "Oh no, is this about Max?" he asked, clearly embarrassed. "He's harmless. He just loves chasing kids on bikes. It's all fun to him." Despite the reassurance, the damage had already been done. Emily's panic wasn't unfounded. To a child unfamiliar with dogs, even playful behavior could seem terrifying. The officers confirmed the dog's identity and ensured it was secured back in the yard, before turning their attention fully to the misunderstanding involving Marcus. By now, Emily's explanation had reached the ears of the growing audience. Some people shifted uncomfortably, guilt creeping into their expressions as they realized how quickly assumptions had spiraled out of control. Others whispered apologies under their breath, though Marcus couldn't hear them. One woman stepped forward timidly, addressing the officers. "I think we may have overreacted," she admitted quietly. "When we saw the girl crying and clinging to him, we assumed, well, we shouldn't have assumed anything." Her words hung in the air, heavy with regret. The initial 911 caller, a middle-aged man holding his phone awkwardly, looked down at his shoes, avoiding eye contact with anyone. He hadn't meant to cause trouble. He'd simply reacted based on what he'd seen. A young white girl sobbing and clinging to a black man. In that split second, his mind had jumped to conclusions, fueled by ingrained biases he likely didn't even realize he held. For Marcus, standing quietly off to the side, the realization stung deeply. He understood that people made mistakes, but this wasn't just a simple error in judgment. It was a reflection of something much larger, something systemic. As much as he wanted to brush it off, he couldn't ignore the knot of frustration tightening in his chest. This wasn't the first time he'd faced suspicion or hostility without cause, and he doubted it would be the last. Emily's parents arrived soon after, alerted by a neighbor who recognized the chaos outside. They rushed to their daughter's side, enveloping her in hugs and peppering her with questions. Once assured she was unharmed, they turned their attention to Marcus. "Thank you for being there for her," Emily's mother said sincerely, her voice thick with emotion. Her father echoed the sentiment, shaking Marcus's hand firmly. "We're so sorry for whatever happened here. You didn't deserve this." Marcus nodded stiffly, offering a polite smile despite the storm of emotions swirling inside him. While their apology was heartfelt, it couldn't erase the weight of the moment. The accusing stares, the raised voices, the flashing lights. As the officers finally wrapped up their investigation and dismissed the crowd, Marcus returned to his truck, his movements slower than usual. The morning had started so peacefully, yet now it felt tainted, leaving him to wonder how many more times he'd have to prove his humanity in a world quick to doubt it. Weeks turned into months, and the neighborhood continued to transform in subtle but meaningful ways. The Know Your Neighbor initiative had blossomed into something far greater than anyone anticipated. What began as a handful of tentative introductions grew into regular gatherings. Picnics in the park, block parties, and even weekly book clubs hosted in residents' backyards. People who had lived side by side for years without ever exchanging more than a nod now found themselves sharing stories over coffee or helping each other with home repairs. The once invisible walls between neighbors were slowly crumbling, replaced by bridges built on trust and understanding. Marcus remained at the heart of this change, though he never sought the spotlight. His role as a mentor expanded beyond teaching kids about recycling. He became a trusted figure in the community, someone people turned to for advice or encouragement. Parents appreciated his patience with their children, while older residents valued his wisdom and calm demeanor. On weekends, he often joined local cleanup efforts, leading groups of volunteers armed with trash bags and gloves. Together, they tackled neglected corners of the neighborhood, turning eyesores into vibrant green spaces. Each small victory reminded everyone that progress was possible when people worked together. Emily, too, continued to grow from the experience. Inspired by Marcus's kindness and the lessons her parents had taught her, she took it upon herself to spread positivity wherever she could. At school, she started a kindness club, encouraging classmates to perform random acts of goodwill, holding doors open for strangers, writing thank you notes to teachers, or simply smiling at someone having a tough day. Her enthusiasm was contagious, and soon the club had dozens of members eager to make a difference. When asked why she started the group, Emily's answer was simple: because one person can change how someone feels, just like Mr. Marcus changed how I felt. Her family stayed deeply involved in the community's efforts as well. They attended every event, volunteered for projects, and made a conscious effort to challenge their own biases whenever they surfaced. Emily's father, in particular, became an advocate for open dialogue, hosting discussions in his garage where neighbors could talk openly about uncomfortable topics like racial profiling and implicit bias. These conversations weren't always easy. There were moments of tension, frustration, and disagreement, but they were necessary. Slowly but surely, they helped chip away at the barriers that had divided the community for so long. As autumn gave way to winter, the streets were adorned with twinkling lights and wreaths hung on front doors. The annual holiday parade rolled through the neighborhood, drawing crowds of bundled-up families cheering from the sidelines. This year, however, there was a new addition to the festivities: a float decorated with recycled materials, designed and built by none other than Marcus and his young protégés. As they waved to the crowd, their faces glowing with pride, it was clear that the spirit of unity had taken root in the hearts of everyone present. But perhaps the most profound change was the shift in perspective. Neighbors no longer saw Marcus solely as the garbage man. To them, he was a friend, a teacher, a leader, a vital part of the fabric that held their community together. And Marcus, for his part, felt a renewed sense of belonging. He still encountered challenges, moments when old prejudices reared their heads, but he faced them with resilience, knowing he wasn't alone anymore. One chilly evening, as snowflakes began to fall, Marcus stood outside his apartment, gazing at the quiet street below. The world seemed softer somehow, quieter yet full of promise. Vanessa joined him, wrapping a scarf around his neck. "You've done good, love," she said softly, leaning against him. Marcus smiled, looking out at the houses aglow with warm light. "I didn't do it alone," he replied. "We did it together." And in that moment, surrounded by the hum of a neighborhood coming alive with hope and connection, Marcus knew they had turned a corner. The scars of that fateful morning would always remain, but they had become reminders, not of fear or division, but of growth, healing, and the power of humanity to rise above its flaws. The seasons would continue to change, just as people would continue to evolve. But one thing was certain: this neighborhood, once fractured, was now forever bound by the courage to confront its truths and the determination to build a brighter future for everyone. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, Marcus sat alone at his kitchen table, staring at a half-empty cup of coffee. The day's events replayed in his mind like a broken record, each moment sharper and more vivid than the last. He could still hear the sirens, see the flashing lights, feel the weight of dozens of eyes on him, all judging, assuming, doubting. It wasn't the first time he'd faced prejudice, but this felt different. This time, it had happened in broad daylight, in front of people who knew him, in a place where he thought he belonged. Vanessa, his wife, leaned against the doorway, watching him quietly. She had listened to his account of the incident earlier, her face tightening with anger and sadness. Now, as she stepped into the room and placed a comforting hand on his shoulder, "Tell me what you're thinking," she said softly, her voice steady but laced with concern. For a long moment, Marcus didn't respond. When he finally spoke, his words came out slowly, weighed down by emotion. "I don't know why it keeps happening," he admitted, shaking his head. "I try so hard to be kind, to help people, to show them I'm not whatever they think I am. But no matter what I do, it's never enough." His voice cracked slightly, and he looked down at his hands, calloused from years of hard work. "Today wasn't about me. It was about that little girl. I did nothing wrong, and yet everyone acted like I was some kind of monster." Vanessa pulled up a chair beside him, her dark eyes filled with empathy. "You're right. You didn't do anything wrong," she said firmly. "But the problem isn't you. It's the way people see you before they even know you. That's not fair, and it's not okay." Her words were simple, but they carried a truth that resonated deeply. Marcus nodded, though the frustration in his chest refused to ease. "I just wish it didn't have to be this way," he murmured. "Why does it always feel like I have to prove myself?" The next morning, Emily's parents knocked on Marcus's door again, this time carrying the handwritten note. They looked nervous, almost hesitant, as if unsure how their apology would be received. Marcus opened the door and greeted them warmly, inviting them inside despite his lingering unease. Emily stood shyly behind her mother, clutching a stuffed animal to her chest. Her father cleared his throat and held out the folded piece of paper. "We wanted to say we're sorry for everything," he began, his voice thick with sincerity. "And Emily wanted to write something for you." Marcus took the note and unfolded it carefully. In childish scrawl, the words read, "Thank you for making me feel safe. You are nice." A small heart was drawn in the corner, its uneven lines adding charm rather than detracting from it. Despite himself, Marcus smiled. A genuine, heartfelt smile that reached his eyes. "Thank you, sweetheart," he said, looking directly at Emily. "That means a lot to me." Her parents exchanged relieved glances before speaking again. "We've been talking about what happened," Emily's mother added, her tone earnest. It made us realize how important it is to teach our kids and ourselves to see people for who they really are, not for what we assume. Marcus appreciated their honesty, though he couldn't help but notice the fragility in their words. Apologies were a start, but they weren't enough to undo years of ingrained biases or systemic issues. Later that week, local activists organized a community meeting at the neighborhood recreation center. Flyers were posted around town, urging residents to attend and discuss ways to foster trust and understanding within the community. When Marcus arrived, he was surprised to find the room packed with familiar faces, neighbors, friends, and even strangers who had heard about the incident through social media. As he took his seat near the front, he felt a mix of apprehension and hope bubbling inside him. When it was his turn to speak, Marcus stood up, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the microphone. For a brief second, he hesitated, unsure how to put his feelings into words. Then, taking a deep breath, he began. What happened to me isn't unique. It happens every day, all over the world, to people who look like me. But what makes today different is that we're here, we're talking about it. And maybe, just maybe, that's the first step toward change. His voice grew stronger as he continued, sharing his perspective with raw honesty. By the time he finished, the room erupted in applause, not out of pity but out of respect. For the first time in days, Marcus felt seen, not as a stereotype or a suspect, but as a human being worthy of dignity and trust. Though the road ahead remained uncertain, he left the meeting feeling cautiously optimistic. Change wouldn't come easily, but perhaps this community was ready to take the first steps together.